They should make a movie about this. So this movie just kind of happened, didn't it? I mean, personally, I wasn't trying to follow the production of this film, but no matter where I looked online, you couldn't avoid it. I mean, when the movie was first announced, you had everyone pointing and laughing at the cast and how generic it all sounded.
What the fuck?
I mean, the only two that made sense were Jack Black and Charlie Day. And the movie was going to be made by Illumination Animation, who have a great track record. Suffice to say, expectations were pretty low. But then the movie released, and I started hearing some decent things about it. People seemed to be enjoying it, with the only major complaint that I was hearing was people saying it was too fast-paced. Which admittedly was very worrying for me. With movies like Puss in Boots coming out, I was expecting something along the lines of that. And then if you had two movies around the same time that were both incredibly fast-paced, do incredibly well, I just knew that's all animation was going to be in the future. Just every company shifting their movies to be as quick as possible for, like, retention. Movies for the TikTok generation, if you will. But then I finally got to see it for myself. So let's start off with the positive. Firstly, I think the voice acting was fine. It wasn't too distracting for the most part, even if the cast was a bit generic on paper. I think the way they handled Mario's character was pretty decent. The idea of, you know, the voice just being for branding purposes, I think that's probably, it's the most obvious way they could have handled it, but it's also the best way, so you can't really complain too much. The only voices that really bothered me whilst I was watching the film were Seth Rogen for Donkey Kong and Keegan-Michael Key as Toad. I mean, Toad just sounded like Keegan-Michael Key trying to do a Toad impression that wasn't that convincing, but would be funny if you were drunk. And Seth Rogen just sounds like Seth Rogen, who I hate. Also, Peach plays a completely different character in the movie. I guess someone thought it would be a bad idea to have her continue the role of damsel in distress. So they decided instead to push poor Luigi to the sidelines and make him the damsel instead. The pacing for the most part was actually kind of fine. I was expecting something along the lines of Puss in Boots, the way that everyone was talking about it, but it wasn't really like that at all. There were definitely a lot of slowed down scenes that weren't trying to be over the top all the time and just keep everything moving, which isn't a bad thing. You need scenes that kind of slow things down a bit, and this movie definitely has that to a decent enough extent to where the pacing doesn't feel unnatural, but it's not rushed either. I guess what people were really referencing when they were talking about the movie being quite fast paced was the fact that it kind of follows video game logic in terms of how you build your team and how the cast kind of come into a group. It was a very basic structure of go to a new location, do a very specific task for a character, and then they just agree to help you, which didn't bother me that much. Also, I found that the references in the movie weren't that annoying for the most part. You know, you go into this kind of movie like you would a Marvel film, where you just kind of sit there and wait for something that you recognize, which I guess a lot of people can find to be fun. And to an extent, when I'm out with friends, it's an enjoyable experience, I guess. A lot of the references weren't too in your face, like the GameCube references, Kid Icarus on the NES, you know, but then you also had scenes like the Mario Kart on Rainbow Road. I think if there were a few more scenes like that in the movie, where clearly there's no purpose to the scenes, it's just for the sake of referencing something, I would find it more annoying, but they only do that like once or twice in the film, so honestly, it didn't bother me. The music, I would say, was pretty enjoyable overall. There were definitely some instances where it was very obvious and obnoxious, but then there were also other times where it was quite a niche reference that not many people would get, that kind of rewards those who are paying attention. Like playing the Mario Kart 8 menu theme during the scene where they're building their cars. It's like it was kind of just quietly in the background there. But if you noticed it, it was a cool addition, I suppose. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention that Peaches song. Moving on to the negative.
Peaches, 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 peaches.
The animation doesn't look bad, especially compared to some of Illumination's worst films, but it's not good either. It's very kind of generic. There is the occasional scene that looks good and is quite atmospheric, but for the most part it kind of reminds me of those generic New Super Mario Bros. Games where everyone was complaining that the art style was boring, and yet when you throw that same generic cutesy art style into a movie, it's like it doesn't really bother people anymore. The plot of this movie is so basic and so stretched out thin that if you were to write an in-depth breakdown of the specific plot of this movie and then take basic bullet points from the Lego movie, you'd basically have the same story, and then just throw in a couple Mario things and have Luigi get kidnapped by President Business. I feel like a lot of people are definitely going too easy on this film, purely for the sake of, well, it's a movie about Mario, of course the plot isn't going to be very in-depth. Then why make it in the first place? If there was no idea, no inspiration or message that you wanted to convey, then this movie was just made for the sake of making it, and for the sake of a corporation making a shit ton of money. It's like the most common type of movie that there is now. Here's a thing that people recognize. Let's just throw in a bunch of other references that people will recognize, and we'll just turn it into a film. You don't even need an idea anymore, or a reason for doing it. In my next video, I talk about the infamous idea that cinema is dead, and I feel like it fits a lot better here. Nobody wants to go to the cinema for the sake of experiencing something new anymore. Everyone just wants to go and stare at things they recognize.